There's a moment that stays with you your whole life, not because it was loud or dramatic, but because it was quiet, and you let it pass. My name is Walter. I'm 88 years old, and the biggest mistake I ever made didn't happen in one day. It happened in 1,000 small days where I chose the wrong thing, and told myself it didn't matter. I was born in 1936, in a small town in rural Pennsylvania. The kind of place where everybody knew your father's name before they knew yours. My father was a steel worker. Broad shoulders, quiet hands. A man who never said much but meant everything he did say. He used to come home covered in soot, and my mother would hand him a towel before he even got through the door, and he'd nod at her in this way that I didn't understand when I was young. I understand it now. That nod was everything. It was thank you, and I see you, and I'm tired, and I love you all in one small motion. I didn't know that then. I thought love was supposed to be bigger than that. I grew up wanting to be bigger than my father. Not better, bigger. There's a difference, and it took me most of my life to learn it. My father was a content man, and I mistook contentment for smallness. I thought the men who had more, who drove nicer cars and wore suits, and had offices with their names on the door, I thought they had figured something out that my father hadn't. So from the time I was about 16, I decided I was going to figure it out too. I met Margaret when I was 22. She was working the counter at a diner on 5th Street, and she had this laugh, the kind that came from somewhere deep and real, not polished or practiced. She laughed like she meant it. I fell in love with her before I even knew her last name. We married 2 years later, in a small ceremony in her parents' backyard, and I remember standing there looking at her in that white dress she'd sewn herself, and I thought, this is it. This is the thing I was always moving toward. And I meant that. I genuinely meant it. But meaning something and living by it are two different things, and that difference is where most of the damage in a person's life happens. By the time I was 30, I was working for an accounting firm in Pittsburgh. I was good at numbers, always had been, and I moved up quickly. My boss at the time, a man named Harlan, he pulled me aside one afternoon and said, "Walter, you've got the kind of mind that could go very far." And that sentence lit something in me that I don't think ever fully went out. I wanted to prove him right. I wanted to prove everyone right who had ever looked at me and seen potential. I started staying later at the office. I started taking on more clients. I told Margaret it was temporary, that once we got to a certain point financially, things would slow down and we'd have more time together. I believed that when I said it. That's the thing people don't always understand about men who make this kind of mistake. We're not lying. We genuinely believe the sacrifice is temporary. Our daughter Ruth was born in 1962. Then our son David came along in 1965, and I was present for both births. I was there, but I wasn't truly present in the way that matters, in the day-to-day accumulation of small moments. That is what a childhood is actually made of. I worked. I provided. I came home when I could. On weekends I sometimes took David to the park, and Ruth and I had a tradition of watching the Saturday evening news together. She loved it for reasons I never fully understood. She was curious about the world even as a little girl. I held on to those moments as proof that I was a good father, but I was using the best moments to cover for the missing ones. And children notice the missing ones more than you think. Margaret never complained loudly. That was her way. She was a quiet woman with a very clear interior life, and she expressed her unhappiness not in arguments, but in a kind of gradual withdrawal that I convinced myself was just her personality. She became more self-sufficient over the years, built her own routines, her own friendships, her own small world inside the house. And I was grateful for it, because it meant there was less friction. I didn't understand that the friction was actually the relationship. Her pushing back, her wanting more of me. That was love. When she stopped pushing, I should have understood what that meant. I didn't. By my mid-40s, I was a partner at the firm. I had the office with my name on the door. I had everything I'd told myself I was working toward. And I remember the night I came home after finding out about the partnership, expecting Margaret to be as thrilled as I was, and she smiled and said, "That's wonderful, Walter," and went back to the book she was reading. And something in me registered that that wasn't the reaction I'd imagined. But instead of sitting down and asking her what was wrong, instead of saying, "Margaret, talk to me," I poured myself a drink and watched the news and told myself she was tired. We didn't divorce. I want to be clear about that, because the story isn't as simple as a marriage falling apart in a legal sense. We stayed together for 44 years until she passed in 2006. But there is a kind of distance that settles between two people when one of them has been consistently chosen against, not dramatically, not cruelly, but consistently, and that distance becomes the permanent geography of the relationship. You live inside it so long you stop noticing it. You only notice it when one of you is gone. When Margaret died, the grief I felt wasn't only for losing her. It was for losing the version of our life together that I had always told myself was just around the corner. The slower years, the mornings on the porch, the trips we'd talked about taking, all of that had been theoretical for decades, something we'd get to eventually and then eventually ran out. She left before we got there. I have had to live with that, and I'm telling you there is no accounting for what it cost you. It cost you more than I know how to say. Ruth and David, my children, they're good people. They call me, they visit, they love me in the way adult children love a parent. They're not quite sure they fully know, and that's on me. I was present enough that they don't feel abandoned, but absent enough that there's a formality between us that I wish wasn't there. When David and I talk, there's always this slight pause before the real things get said, like we both remember that we're still finding our way to each other, even now. Ruth is warmer. She got more of her mother in her, and sometimes when she laughs I hear Margaret so clearly that I have to look away. I'm not telling you this so you'll feel sorry for me. I've had a full life in many ways. I've been fortunate in more ways than most people I grew up with. But I was also wrong about the most important things at exactly the times it mattered most to be right. I believed that providing for people was the same as being with them. I believed that the future was infinite, that there would always be more time to fix the things that needed fixing. I believed that my family understood I loved them even when I wasn't showing it. Some of those beliefs were partially true, but partial truths are not enough to build a life on. I know that now. If I could go back, and I know this is what everyone who has lived this long says, but I have thought about it carefully, and I mean it specifically, I would not try to do less work or have less ambition. I would try to understand earlier that the people in my life were not waiting for me. They were living, and every year I was elsewhere was a year of their living that I missed. Margaret had a whole interior world that I only caught glimpses of. My children had childhoods that mostly happened without me in the room. I thought I was building something for them. I was, but I was also missing the thing I was supposedly building it for. The strange thing about being 88 is that the regrets are very clear and very specific, but the anger is almost gone. I'm not angry at myself the way I was in my 60s when I first started to really understand what I'd done. Now I just feel a kind of clear sadness, the way the sky looks after a long rain. Everything is very defined. I know exactly who I was, and exactly where I went wrong, and exactly what it cost. There's something almost peaceful about that clarity, even though the clarity is painful. I think about my father sometimes, that man I once mistook for small. He died at 71, not old enough, but he died in a house full of people who genuinely knew him, who had been in the room with him, who had accumulated enough ordinary days with him that they carried him in their bones. I used to think I had surpassed him. I had more to show for my life in the material sense. But he left something that I'm not sure I left, which is the feeling in other people that he had truly been there. Not everywhere, not in every city, not in every boardroom. Right there with them in the small rooms where real life happens. Whatever you're working toward right now, I'm not telling you to stop. I'm telling you that the people near you are not a reward you get when you arrive somewhere. They are the arriving. And if you keep postponing the present moment in favor of some future version of your life that will finally be calm enough, finally successful enough, finally ready enough for the people you love, you may find, as I did, that the future has a way of simply running out. I am 88 years old, and I am telling you this because you still have time to do what I did not. Be in the room. Be in the ordinary room. That is the only place any of it ever actually happens.